Russia has had 11 years with every advantage and without the West fully committing to helping Ukraine, and yet Russia still only controls about 20% of Ukraine.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Events Series. It is great to see that so many of you have joined us today by Zoom. We have a global audience from North Carolina and from across the United States, and indeed from abroad. I'm Klaus Lars, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've run the Krasno Global Events Series since 2012, and we are still going strong. Today, our honored guest is General Ben Hodges, who will be familiar to most of you, not least from his many media appearances on CNN and elsewhere, but Ben Hodges has also been on the Krasno Global Events Series several times, and always with great success. Thank you, Ben, for joining us again today. I know you have a very busy schedule. How are you doing today?
Professor Lars, thank you very much for the privilege to come back. We're doing well. It was a good summer, but ready to kick off the fall campaign.
Thanks very much. Today, we need to talk once again about the unfortunate situation in the Ukraine war and the lack of progress in reaching a ceasefire or even a real peace treaty. Only today, the so-called Coalition of the Willing met in Paris, but I'm not sure whether or not this was actually a productive meeting. Putin's never-ending wars, the delusion of peace in our times. That is the title of our Krasno event today. General Hodges will also touch upon many other urgent issues. What is the military situation on the ground in Ukraine? How strong or weak is Russia's military and the country's economy? How close are Russia's relations with China and North Korea? And what about Zelensky and Trump? Have they really become best friends again? And can we expect an end to the war anytime soon, and under which conditions? And of course, we have to talk about the security guarantees the Europeans and the US keep talking about with regard to the situation once Russia's war on Ukraine has come to an end. I'm certainly glad to have General Ben Hodges with us today to shed some light on these and many other complex issues and developments. Let me introduce Ben Hodges to you briefly. General Ben Hodges is a former commanding general of the US Army Europe, and he now serves on a number of international advisory boards, including the New Strategy Center in Romania, the Warsaw Security Forum in Poland, and the Renew Democracy Initiative in New York City, as well as the Atlantic Brücke. Ben also consults for several companies on Europe, NATO, and the European Union, and he's the co-author of the book Future War and the Defense of Europe, published by Oxford University Press. During his long military career, Ben Hodges served several times in Iraq and in a variety of senior joint and army staff positions in Korea, for example, and in the Pentagon. From 2012 to 2014, he served as Commander, NATO Allied Land Command in Izmir, Turkey. And his last military assignment was as Commanding General, United States Army Europe in Wiesbaden, Germany, from 2014 to 2017. He retired from the US Army in January 2018, and Ben Hodges now lives in Frankfurt, Germany. And that is where Ben also joins us from today. And in Frankfurt, I think it is shortly after 8 p.m. in the evening. Welcome, General Hodges. It's great to have you with us again at the Krasno Global Event Series here at UNC Chapel Hill. Let me ask you straight away. Sure. Let me ask you straight away. Is Russia winning the war in Ukraine? And will President Zelensky have to make lots of territorial concessions and sue for peace with Putin?
No and no. Russia has had 11 years with every advantage and without the West fully committing to helping Ukraine, and yet Russia still only controls about 20% of Ukraine. They've suffered over 1 million casualties. The great Russian Black Sea Fleet is not even a factor anymore. They don't threaten Ukraine except with long-range missiles. The great Russian Air Force has failed its number one task of achieving air superiority, and it's failed number two task of interdicting the highways and rail lines bringing equipment and ammunition from Poland into Ukraine. So in all of these facets of the war, they have failed miserably. The problem is, it doesn't matter how many Russian troops get killed in this war because the Kremlin doesn't care about that. The Kremlin will keep doing what they're doing as long as, number one, Putin thinks he has a chance, which really means that the West will quit, or as long as he has oil that he can sell to China and India and Turkey and a couple of other countries to keep his war machine going.
Yeah, thank you. But are you not slightly too optimistic? Last time when you came and talked to us, you mentioned that Ukraine was winning the war, that Ukraine would push back the Russian forces. And if I understand it correctly, at the moment Russia seems to make some military progress and seems to be winning the war. Isn't that correct?
No, that's not correct. What I said before, and you're right, I could always be accused of being overly optimistic. But the fact is, what I had always said was if the West gives Ukraine what they need, then absolutely Ukraine would be able to push Russia back into across their own border. Without the Biden administration or the Trump administration ever saying that we even wanted Ukraine to win, without ever clearly stating an objective, what our strategic objective is, we have failed to have the right policies, that's the US, that would deliver Ukraine what it needed. And using all of our economic tools, we haven't even done that. And yet Russia not do more than what they're doing now. I think if you can look at a map, not at headlines, but look at the map and see what kind of territorial gains Russia has made, we're talking about minuscule size of a football field gains at thousands of casualties. So I would say that the Ukrainians have done a very good job in a situation where the Russians have all the advantages of mass, without us providing them all the long-range precision weapons that they needed. We have not done a good job of putting economic leverage on Russia. Uh, so if we get serious, if the president would say it's in our interest that Ukraine defeats Russia, pushes them back their side of the border, that then we enacted the policies would make that possible. Stick with my assessment that this thing would be over actually in a few months. Think about Russia, they import artillery ammunition from North Korea, the great Russia, with its defense industry, has to import artillery ammunition from North Korea. They need parts from China. They initially were getting drones from Iran. So I think that the state of Russia's economy and their war industry is very fragile. And if we were serious and put the right economic pressure on them, it would collapse.
But Trump doesn't seem to be serious, if I understand it correctly. He has had a very good meeting with Putin in Alaska. He seems to always give in to Putin. Deadlines come and go and nothing happens. And all the new sanctions on Putin never happen. He even has second thoughts about delivering military and financial aid to Ukraine. So what is happening? Why is he not doing what you suggested?
Well, you remember that during the campaign, candidate Trump said that he would end the war in 24 hours. Now, I don't think many people took him literally at that, but there was an expectation, perhaps by some, that he would come in. And when he took office, he had enormous leverage over Russia. He could tell the Russians, say, "Look, I'm going to wreck your oil and gas industry by doing things that would manipulate the price, that would help stop these shadow fleet vessels from going in and out the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. There was a lot he could do, plus to agree with allies to use all of the frozen Russian assets, 300 billion euro frozen assets. He could have done that. He could have said, I'm going to give Ukraine everything they need. I mean, there was so much he could have done, and instead he chose to do none of it. And I would say that the Trump administration's approach was doomed from the very beginning because they never understood or else never cared about the origin of the conflict. Instead, they routinely used the Kremlin talking points and kind of said, I mean, when Secretary Rubio in the first weeks said, well, Ukraine's going to have to give up territory. Why? Why is that your starting point for a so-called negotiation? And I think that the fact that Mr. Witkoff was the lead envoy, who had zero uh, experience or expertise about how to deal with the Russians. I mean, this is not like doing a real estate deal in Manhattan. We're talking about dealing with these old guys, Lavrov and that crew. And I mean, he didn't even take a State Department interpreter with him. So the whole approach that they have used has been wrong from the very beginning. They don't understand why the war started. They can't say that Russia is the aggressor. Not once has the president or the vice president or the Secretary of State said, Russia, get your troops out of Ukraine. And so if you can't even, and then the other day, Vice President Vance was very dismissive in an interview when he said, you talked about nitpicky details like who started the war. If you're trying to stop a war, who started it is kind of an important part. It's not nitpicky. So while I was not pleased with what the Biden administration did, that they never really identified an end state and their support was intermittent, um, the Trump administration has been even worse because they pretty much don't do anything. And the Kremlin sees it. This meeting in Alaska, that was a colossal failure and an embarrassment for the United States. The only person that benefited from that was Vladimir Putin.
There was a General Kellogg who was also involved on behalf of the Trump administration. So he was a military. He seems to have a greater understanding of the forces on the ground. But he was pretty non-effective, or how would you evaluate his influence?
Well, he was not effective from the beginning, and that's why the administration then reassigned him to be the liaison to the Ukrainians, while Witkoff is the liaison to the negotiator or the envoy to the Kremlin. So General Kellogg, he certainly understands why people fight and what's at stake. I think he also still is unable or unwilling to diverge from the White House and to be more clear about who the aggressor is and to explain that. And so um, the Russians see that. So they know they really have nothing to fear from the United States. I mean, I don't know how many times the president said, well, we'll know in 2 weeks. We'll do something in 2 weeks or 50 days. All of these deadlines have come and gone, zero consequences for the Russians. And so now the Russians mock the United States. They have no respect for us, but unfortunately, they also have very little respect for Europe.
How do you evaluate Trump's strange, fascinating relationship with Putin? This seems to be highly unusual, and he seems to be taken for a ride by Putin. And of course, would be something he doesn't like, and he minds it, but he doesn't seem to react to it. How do you explain that?
Well, of course, I cannot explain that. I think a lot of real psychologists and wannabe psychologists have tried to examine his personality. What is it? Why does he do what he does? Um, I have hoped for several months that he would eventually get so mad when he could see that the Russians were mocking him and not following through on any agreement. Um, that after each phone call or each meeting that night, there's hundreds of drones go against Ukrainian cities. So at some point, I thought, okay, he's finally going to say that's enough and use some of the enormous power and leverage that he has. But not one time has he done it. He still can't say. The worst thing he can possibly say is, "I'm really disappointed in President Putin." That's not exactly the kind of thing that's going to cause the Russians to change behavior.
Mhm. And what about the Europeans? You mentioned the Europeans. The Russians are not respecting Europeans. How important is that coalition of the willing?
Well, I think first of all, the Russians are watching and they can see. Of course, Europe is not one homogeneous entity. You've got the European Union, which has 27 nations. Then you've got Norway and UK. Plus, Canada is not European, but obviously it's has a very strong affiliation with most of Europe's views of Russia. Um, I think that the most encouraging thing I saw was about 3 weeks ago when several European leaders showed up at the White House, I think, to protect President Zelensky. This was just a few days, you remember, after the so-called Alaska summit. Um, and there was the German Bundeskanzler Merz, Prime Minister Meloni of Italy, uh, President Stubb of Finland, Prime Minister Starmer of UK, President Macron of France, and then you also had Secretary General Rutte of NATO and Dr. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission. So they're all at the table there. And I was impressed because that was the most together, uniformly aligned I've seen from those leaders. And they were not there to pay homage to the American president. They were there to protect President Zelensky because they remembered what happened last time Zelensky had gone to the White House. And I think, honestly, they don't trust the American president. And so they wanted to show some solidarity there. And the most powerful thing I heard was after President Trump said, well, first we need to have a bilat between President Zelensky and President Putin, which, by the way, is never, ever going to happen. Those two meet, and then we'll have a trilat where I, President Trump, will then come in there and we'll get the deal done. And President Macron said, actually, it needs to be a quadrilat because this is about European security, not only Ukrainian security. That's the key, that Europeans realize that if they cannot count on the United States to even be an active part of all of this, and if Ukraine fails, you're going to see another maybe 20 million Ukrainian refugees pouring into Central and Western Europe because they know what happens when the Red Army shows up. And of course, the Russian army will absorb tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops into the Red Army. So I think European countries get it. They understand what the risk is, but they have not yet been able to come together on the, okay, so what do we do, that part.
Thank you. But what was the point of actually suggesting a bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin? Because that was pretty easy to see that that would maybe never happen. And even if it happened, that it would not be very fruitful at all.
I think that that underlines their lack of understanding of who and what Russia is, what's at stake here. I mean, I have to say this, the administration has treated this as if they were haggling over townhouses in Brooklyn or something like that. Not, and we talk about, we got to give us some territory. This is not dirt. There's 4 million Ukrainians live in the parts of in the occupied parts of Ukraine that they're talking about. So it's not dirt; these are people, and that's why President Zelensky, I think, has courageously said, "No, we're not going to just give up land and hope that that's enough for Putin because there are Ukrainian citizens that live there." And I think, and you as a professor of history, you and your students, of course, know very well, there's almost no time in history where somebody was under enormous pressure, and if they gave in, if they gave up something, that would satisfy the aggressor. It never does.
Mm-hmm. So how strong are the Europeans in your view? They are still highly dependent on American military hardware, also on some other intelligence information from the United States. Can they really play an independent role at all in the war?
Well, first of all, yes, they absolutely could, but it would require the political will to do what's necessary. I mean, I think if you add together the populations, the industry, the wealth, the technological advantages of Europe, including Norway, UK, and Canada, it dwarfs Russia. I mean, it's not even close. It's such a gap. Um, but that would require them working together. And of course, you're always going to have like, Fico in Slovakia and Orban in Hungary. I, I would not assume that they're going to do anything helpful. But the other countries uh, do have capabilities. Now, what the one thing that they can't match with Russia, of course, is nuclear weapons. You have France and UK have nuclear weapons, but you don't have to match numbers. Like you don't have to have 5,000 nuclear weapons like the Russians do, or whatever their number is now. Uh, but the Russians would have to believe that France or UK might actually put a nuclear weapon on St. Petersburg or Moscow to have an effective nuclear deterrent. So that's I don't know that that is such a big disparity that it would matter. The things that the U.S. has always provided that our allies just have not invested in are large scale logistics. You know, our great Air Force, these transport aircraft. Nobody in the world has that kind of capability that we do. The numbers. So this has been based on choices by European countries, and so some of them are going to have to start paying for these expensive uh, things like C-17s, you know, wherever they come from, to me is not relevant. Although, of course, I always love it when they buy American-made equipment. Air defense systems, you know, Patriot is best in class for what it does, but there are other capabilities that are manufactured in France, Germany, Baltic countries as well. The intelligence, of course, the United States has not only a gazillion satellites, but also an infrastructure of people, professional women and men, officers, civilians, and so on, that really give us unique advantages. But there may be one or two intelligence professionals in the audience tonight, they would tell you how much we depend on allies for intelligence as well. So it's this trusting network of intelligence sharing that goes on between us and our allies and friends uh, in all different aspects or domains of the intelligence field. um, that's something you can't just replace. And so it would take some time for Europe to fill the gap if the United States, for some bizarre reason, pulled out of that. But we would only be screwing ourselves if we did that because, you know, Europe is our biggest trading partner as a bloc, and we need allies, and all of our best and most reliable allies come from Europe as well as Canada and Australia. So, although I have to say that even in the intelligence arena, um, there is lost trust because people look at what's happened with some of the real intelligence pros, both in the agencies as well as in uniform, have been sacked recently. Uh, and these are the kind of things that affect trust that allies have in us. And that worries me long term.
Well, at the recent NATO summit in The Hague in June, there was the general agreement arrived at 5% of each country's GDP would be dedicated to defense as an upper ceiling, really. Do you think that's real? That will get the Europeans to so-called strategic autonomy, as the French like to call it?
Well, first of all, I have never heard anybody that could actually define strategic autonomy. So, I mean, this is a phrase. It sounds cool until you start like, okay, well, what do you mean autonomy? You know, it's not going to happen. And I don't see the political will for them to say, we don't need anything. We'll do it all ourselves. If that was true, then they would have done it. So I just I don't think too much about that until somebody can actually define what strategic autonomy is. Now, the 5%, look, I think most of us were in the 3.5 to 5% spending anyway back in the Cold War days. I mean, so it's not like this is uncharted territory. We've actually done that. Of course, every nation, including the U.S., would like to put more money into infrastructure and healthcare and education and all these other things. But the fact is, you have to defend yourself, and there is a very real threat. And I meet very few Europeans anymore who scoff at the threat. Of course, where you are on the map affects how you view the threat, but still, um, you know, even in Mediterranean countries, they realize what's at stake, which is why they have soldiers as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence. Um, I like the idea of 3.5% for traditional military spending, if you will, but of course that doesn't mean just stuff. it also means readiness, which is actually should be the number one priority for every Ministry of Defense is, are you ready to do the task? Having the culture of readiness. And that, I think we're going to see that improving in most nations. It's certainly, you can feel it starting to happen here in Germany. The 1.5% on infrastructure, so the 5% is 3.5 for traditional military, 1.5 for infrastructure. No doubt that will be abused by some in some places, but um, anything that improves transportation infrastructure in Europe, that improves cyber protection of our energy infrastructure. Or I even heard yesterday, Prime Minister Carney of Canada say that they were going to use part of their 1.5% infrastructure to go for these strategic materials, rare earth critical minerals that are needed for defense. I'm 100% for that.
But that, if I understand you correctly, it will improve Europe's defenses significantly, but it will not make it independent of the United States and what the United States can bring to the table.
Well, but that's not the purpose of the 5%. The purpose of the 5% was to fulfill obligations that everyone in NATO has under Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, which talks about you have to prepare yourself. You have to defend yourself, and you have to have capabilities to contribute to collective security. So, 2%, 3%, 5%, that's not in the treaty, but that's the legal foundation for it. So the 5% is not so that Europe can be autonomous. I will tell you this, Professor Lars, I think we in the US are going to regret that Europe begins to be less and less dependent on us. The access that we have with bases all over Europe, airports, seaports, training areas, infrastructure, the logistics, the ability to come in and out of there, and we're not there guarding Germans. This is our forward position for what we need to do in Africa and the Middle East, as well as to deter Russia. And I think, as the Europeans need us less, we are going to regret, I think, that lost influence. Fortunately, as often happens, the video of what the administration says and the audio are not yet matching. You still got almost 100,000 U.S. troops in Europe. That's a combination of permanently assigned as well as rotational. Navy and Air Force is still way too small over in Europe, but we still have a very good presence, intelligence infrastructure, logistics. So fortunately, other than casting doubt and making allies worry, we're still there or here.
Well, there are always stories that the Baltic Security Initiative is under threat, which supports the three Baltic states, and that also cuts to Section 333 for the development of training and other equipment for countries along the border with Russia, that will be cut or eliminated altogether. That seems to point into totally the wrong direction.
You're exactly right. That is the wrong direction. I don't know how that makes us more secure by reducing training efforts, reducing the amount of contact we have with allies or with partners like Ukraine.
Isn't the threat perception a problem, not in not in Europe, but in the United States, that the Trump administration doesn't see Russia as that much of a threat, while it wants to focus on the Indo-Pacific and China and seems to regard that as much more of a threat and much more important? Isn't that what explains the Trump administration's perhaps kind of benign attitude to Putin?
Um, I don't know that they just don't see Russia as a threat. Um, but I would say that we are now experiencing some of the symptoms of an administration that doesn't have the best people in the strategic planning and thinking jobs. I mean, the stories of chaos inside the Pentagon are pretty well known. That what's happened there, they just don't have the depth of people there or in the national security staff, uh, and so the strategic thinking that's necessary to look at the world. And Russia, Ukraine, that's not a separate problem set, and then Iran is a problem set, and China. Instead, looking at these as parts of one larger strategic challenge is how I would want to do it. You know, just like well, let's say if you help Ukraine defeat Russia first, Iran becomes totally isolated because Iran has no real friends. North Korea already is somewhat isolated, except for this relationship they have with Russia. So that would further weaken North Korea. And then China, if China is the real threat, then the first thing you want to do is deter them from making bad decisions. And so if they see that we are prepared and we have allies and capabilities and resources to help Ukraine defeat Russia, I think the Chinese would think twice before doing what they're, I believe, are planning to do or are considering doing. Instead, what we have done by, for some strange reason, the administration has chosen to focus extra sanctions on India because India is in fact buying Russian oil a lot, converting it to gas and selling it back to Europe, which is one of the ways around sanctions against buying Russian oil. So India is guilty of that. The problem is the administration has only focused on them. They haven't put the same kind of sanctions on China or other countries that are buying Russian oil, and they certainly have not put meaningful sanctions that change behavior on Russia. So the Indians are obviously extremely unhappy about this. And this is, I think, part of the reason you saw Prime Minister Modi in China the other day. Um, what the administration has done is, in effect, pushed India towards China, which is bizarre if you can think about where they were just over the last few years. And so, if you're thinking strategic, the last thing you would want is India, part of the so-called Quad of countries that are working together in the Indo-Pacific region, to push them into the arms of China. But that's what's happened. So I can't tell who they really think the real um, enemy or threat is in terms of other countries. Instead, most of the most threatening statements have been made against our Danish allies over Greenland, Canada, Panama, and countries like that, Mexico.
Mhm. Apparently, the undersecretary in the Pentagon, Bridge Colby, is the one who pushes the administration away from a focus on Russia and the Ukraine war and towards China and the Indo-Pacific. Is that correct? Is that what you have heard, or are there other people involved?
Well, I think there's always other people, but Bridge Colby is the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, which is really the most powerful and important position in the Pentagon amongst the civilian leadership after the Secretary himself and the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So Bridge is the guy that would be designing strategies and working with the military staffs and thinking through priorities and policies. So either he has zero influence uh, in keeping the White House from making a terrible decision that would push India into the arms of China, or um, this has all been theater and it's not really what the administration is trying to do. Now, he has been on record quite a bit of saying, screw Europe, they need to take care of themselves. We need to focus on China. But again, I mean, if you're supposed to be the strategic genius, I don't think you can divide them up as separate problems like that for the reasons I've already talked about. Um, I do worry that we are in a vulnerable situation now with regards to intelligence, that so much damage has been done to our reputation when it comes to intelligence. People don't trust Director Gabbard. The senior sort of people that were experts on cyber and on Russia, all gone. And I think we're a little bit vulnerable now, and that affects our ability to map out good, effective strategy.
There's a new government in Germany, Chancellor Merz and his coalition. And Germany traditionally, throughout the Cold War and after, has been one of the most loyal supporters of the United States and was very close. Is that still the case, or do you see a more lukewarm attitude creeping in?
Between Germany and the United States?
Because that
Yeah.
is one of the crucial relationship within the transatlantic alliance.
Yeah, I think Germany has been such an important ally for decades, and most of our footprint, if you will, in Europe, headquarters, logistics, maintenance, all of these things, intelligence are based out of Germany, while most of the troops that are actually on the ground are in Eastern Europe. Those are mostly rotational forces coming from different places across the army. So Germany has been important for us as that really solid foundation with all the necessary infrastructure and people that are here. Um, and I was impressed with the German Bundeskanzler's visit to the Oval Office, his first visit there back, I guess that was about 2 months ago, where he had a very good, I was impressed with the meeting he had with President Trump. And it was interesting because, he's taller than President Trump. He's a better golfer than President Trump. And some would say he's actually a better businessman than President Trump. So I think President Trump respected him, much the same way he looked at President Stube and respected him. And I thought Merz handled himself very well in the Oval Office, did not go in there, too much of the, well, you know what I'm trying to say, the way Ruda did, Secretary General Ruda did. I think that was important. And, 80 million Germans were watching to see how would their Bundeskanzler do dealing with Trump, who likes to be flattered. And then what was even more impressive was that the German Bundeskanzler, after that, went on Fox News and gave a long interview on Fox News in English. Of course, it's not a surprise that he speaks English, but when you're in a job in a situation where you don't want to make mistakes on how you speak and understand things, he did extremely well. So I think Germany's in a good place.
So outwardly things are okay, but do the Germans really view the old trusted relationship with the United States as trusting and as reliable as before, or are they also infected by that general suspicion of what is happening in the US?
Almost every single day, some European, particularly Germans, ask me what the hell is going on. They can't believe what they're seeing. Most professional Germans either went to school in the U.S. at some point, or their kids do, or they have business contacts. They know the U.S. And even though Germans have always enjoyed criticizing American policy for different reasons, they always respected the U.S. I mean, I've had so many Germans quote parts of the Constitution to me and talk about checks and balances, and they're asking, where are the checks and balances? How are these things happening that should not be happening? That they are worried and disappointed to see their American ally kind of what we're experiencing now. But they have not given up on us yet. And I think they're trying to decide, like everybody else is this a blip, or does this represent a new era for America? And, they know that 77 million Americans voted for President Trump. And so this is not something that's, when he's done, it's all over. It reveals something about us in their eyes.
Mm-hmm. The midterms will be important. We have to take a few questions from the audience soon, but let me just ask you, what is the situation in Ukraine? Is Ukraine as strong as ever to push back the Russian forces, or is the situation pretty desperate? We have daily drone attacks, often several hundred drone attacks, even on the capital, and of course on various other cities with many civilian deaths on power structures and infrastructure. So Ukraine is in a difficult situation. How difficult is it?
Well, you're right, of course. If you're a civilian that lives in Kherson or Kharkiv or Lviv or Kiev and other places like that, you're seeing drones and missiles, glide bombs on a nightly basis. So that part is terrible. And if you're a Ukrainian soldier in a trench east of Pokrovsk, you're fighting every day. Having said that, that's at the tactical level, and I'm not dismissing it. But what matters, and what the context we're talking now at the strategic level, Ukraine has developed the capability to strike Russia's oil and gas infrastructure. They understand, the Ukrainians understand that Russia cannot win this war, cannot continue the war if they cannot export oil and gas to customers, even at lower than usual prices. And so that's why they're targeting this. And about 20% of Russia's oil and gas infrastructure has been destroyed. Think about that, 20% gone. And so now you see pictures of gas stations in Russia with long lines because there's shortage of gas even inside Russia, which is ironic in and of itself. Right, Ukraine now, about 40% of the weapons and ammunition they use, they make themselves. That's increasing as more and more, I think, European countries, particularly Germany, are investing in Ukraine's defense industry. And I think many people know or may remember that Ukraine was always the heart of the defense industry of the Soviet Union. So you've got I think this is part of the reason they're so quick and innovative with technologies is because you've got this residual technical engineering sort of part of society there in Ukraine. Now, obviously, the Russians are very good at drones as well, so this is tough. But when I think about the great Russian army, they're using motorcycles and golf carts because nobody can get armored vehicles up too close to the front. So they're not going to be able to break through the way their grandfathers did in 1943 and 44, break through and then exploit it. The capability does not exist. All they can do is keep trying to attrit and hope that the West finally gets tired.
Mhm. Does it make sense to talk about security guarantees for after the war? Because right now the war doesn't seem to come to an end anytime soon. So does it make sense, like what we saw in Paris today, talking about the future and security guarantees?
Well, first of all, I really don't like the word security guarantee because that implies something that's not going to ever happen unless they are in NATO. So the only real guarantee is being in NATO. But what we are talking about is help give more deterrence capability to Ukraine so that Russia does not want to attack again. So that means helping grow Ukraine's defense industry, grow the size of their armed forces, continue to help them build up the capabilities they would need to really punish Russia should Russia decide to attack again after however this thing ends. I personally would love to see us doing for Ukraine what we do for Israel, which is to shoot down Russian missiles. Not talking about shooting Russian aircraft, but shoot down missiles and drones. We do that for Israel, along with the Brits and the French and the Jordanians. Why don't we do that for Ukraine? Um, Allied boots on the ground, I think it would be fine as long as the mission was clearly identified. And that's what's been missing so far. I've never heard anybody say what this so-called peacekeeping force or security guarantee force, what's their job? What will they do? That's if I'm the commander, I'll say I can do anything, but tell me what it is you want me to do and give me the right rules of engagement. If I can't shoot back immediately at a Russian that shoots at us, then the Russians will see that this is empty.
Thank you. Before taking some questions, speculate about the future or look into the future. How do you see the situation develop by the end of the year? What will the war look like? Will there be some sort of negotiation having taken place? And will any security guarantees have been agreed upon?
Well, I think unless there is some bizarre, really extreme thing that happens externally, it's not going to be any different come end of this year than it is right now, except you'll have worse weather, of course. But in terms of changing the situation, I just don't see that changing. Ukrainians can see that Russia cannot overwhelm them. They can see that. And if the West would get serious and provide what's needed, and if we would use our economic leverage to help shut down Russia's export of oil and gas, um, I think we'll be in a better position next summer. If that doesn't happen, then I think next summer will look like this summer.
And then there will be negotiations leading to a peace treaty by next summer?
No, it's just going to continue. So it's a matter of endurance. I don't know that even Russia can maintain the manpower that they need and run their industry and all the things they need, as well as have armed forces. Their economy, I mean, everything I read, and there may be some others that will have different views, is that this wartime economy they have is artificially propped up. And so unless China comes in a big way and really helps them, because obviously China benefits from all this. They benefit from having the West all tangled up in this and being occupied while they continue to get oil at bargain basement prices. Um, so China's, I think, is satisfied with where things are.
Mhm. Thanks very much. Zoe, do we have the first question, please?
Hi, yes. Let's see here. Andrew Pruden is asking, what weapon system slash sanctions would you suggest be used that haven't already been tried in the last 3 years that could change the course of the war?
So, great question. The sanctions, of course, should be. I like the Senate version, the sanctions bill. They wanted to put forward that would put massive sanctions on any country that bought Russian oil. That would be China, India, but also our ally Turkey, Japan. All of them buy Russian oil. So you put that kind of a sanction on these countries, they would stop. They would have to stop buying Russian oil. I would be in favor of that. Now, as always is the case with sanctions, there people find ways around it. Just like I mentioned, India is buying Russian oil, they convert it to gas and then sell it back to Europe. You still have countries in Europe that are importing oil and gas. Nothing like what it used to be, but that's still happening to some extent. And there are American companies that are violating sanctions as well, selling things to India, which then end up being repurposed into uh, into Russia, and shining a brighter light on that and punishing companies, American companies that violate the sanctions. In terms of weapon systems, I generally prefer to talk about capability. General Cavoli, when he was Supreme Allied Commander, he said, the way you defeat Russia's advantage of mass is with precision. And by that, he meant if you can hit Russian headquarters, Russian logistics, Russian airfields, it neutralizes Russia's advantage of numbers. Because without those things, it doesn't matter how many unlucky Russian privates you have out there. So the ability to reach several hundred kilometers or 1,000 kilometers to hit those kinds of things, as well as the oil and gas infrastructure, those are the most important weapons I think the Ukrainians need. And then obviously air and missile defense to protect their civilians.
Thank you. Lily, do we have another question?
Yeah, so kind of just following up, speaking on those defense lines, Dave Sidor asks, what is the best defense against drones, and can the Europeans and Ukrainians provide it without the US?
What an excellent question. I think this is what everybody's staying up at night trying to figure out. How do you counter this capability that is so effective? And there's so many different types of drones, and the technologies are getting better. And then, of course, as people figure out more and more how to employ artificial intelligence, then you can have uh, drone swarms and autonomous drones that can do things that will be very, very difficult to counter. But the fact is, over 5,000 years of military history, there's always been, whenever somebody came up with a new thing, eventually the other side would come up with a counter. And that's what's going on now. I think there's always going to be a place for um, uh, concealment and camouflage. I mean, part of this, I was just reading a report 2 days ago from a Finnish gentleman who had been fighting on the Ukrainian side, and he was talking about lessons learned and how do you avoid getting destroyed by Russian drones. And he said, obviously, if there's bad weather or if you're in thick foliage, it's harder to be detected and harder for these FPV drones to get in and find you, which is why you see most vehicles, by the way, have netting and cages on them to try and protect them. So some of this stuff is pretty rudimentary, but also a lot of it's going to be training and discipline. And I know that the U.S. Army at its training centers is looking at or has incorporated this into the training so that people can figure out how to deal with it. And you've got non-kinetic means which break the signal if it's being controlled. Although if you have an autonomous drone, it's not doesn't have a digital link back there. And if it's one of these drones that has wireless, that has fiber optic cable that's out to several kilometers, that there's no signal to intercept. So you have to figure out a different way to do that. You're not going to waste an expensive weapon on a drone, obviously. So this is just going to be part of the environment. Last thing I'd say, though, I heard something the other day that I had never even imagined, that if you can find the wavelength or the digital link that a drone is using long enough, that you could conceivably get your own video into it and deceive the operator into doing something that prevents it from hitting the target. Now that seems kind of like a Mission Impossible kind of a scenario from a movie, but the guy that told me that, he's the kind of person that would know how to do this. So I think we're going to see a lot of developments in the coming months.
Thank you. Zoe, do we have another question?
By the way, last thing, I'm sorry. I have a Ukrainian friend that told me, he's a senior officer, and he told me that when he's out in the field, he's always got a soldier that follows him with a shotgun. So the shotgun is literally the last line of defense. If an FPV drone is spotted you and is coming for you, using a shotgun to knock it down is in fact something that would work in an extreme case.
So I know that you've talked about kind of the U.S. interaction with Israel rather over Ukraine. Jason Dew is curious about whether building a missile defense system for Ukraine, similar to the U.S. that was helped to Israel, be considered a direct intervention in the war by the United States, and what is the fundamental difference under international law between providing such a system to Israel and then one to Ukraine?
These are policy decisions. I don't think there's an international law decision. These are policies and priorities. Why we don't do for Ukraine what we do for Israel. And they didn't do it in the Biden administration either. And I think they were always concerned that Russia would somehow escalate, which is a euphemism for Russia might use a nuclear weapon, which is why, so the Biden administration was held hostage by that concern, which I think was unfounded. And now the Trump administration clearly, seems to be only interested in transactions where if somebody buys American stuff to do it, great. So this is a policy decision, and this goes back to my original point that the importance of clearly defining the objective. I mean, you can't fight a war if you don't declare what the end state is. What do you want to accomplish? Stopping the killing is not an end state because that ignores why is there killing. So figuring out the end state, and then you can come up with policies that help you get to that end state. To me, this is basic stuff, but the last administration and this administration, neither of them have done that. And our European allies have also stopped short of doing that. To say we're with you for as long as it takes is a completely empty political statement, and nobody believes it anyway.
Putin has talked about using nuclear weapons a few times. Medvedev, his loyal disciple as well. Is that real, or is that just, an empty threat?
It's an empty threat. Of course, Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons, and to not use them would not be one based on moral judgments, but it's because they know they get no benefit from it. I mean, where would they employ a nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon that would change things? I think what we should be doing is not allowing Russia to threaten us with a tactical nuclear weapon, because then every nation that has a nuke or wants a nuke could see that the United States can be blackmailed just by the threat of using a tactical nuclear weapon. So the Russians will trot out Medvedev, or Putin will say something just to keep reminding everybody, hey, we have nuclear weapons. And our response should be like, well, good, we have thousands also. And, next time you threaten use of a nuclear weapon, we're going to send another ship full of ammunition to Ukraine. And don't allow this country that is rotten to its core and has an economy the size of Spain, don't allow them to dictate terms to us and all of Europe.
It seems to be Putin who has all the skills in this game. He seems to be a very skillful manipulator and negotiator, and he seems to really dictate the course of events right now. Or is that not a right interpretation?
I think that's probably pretty close. He probably can't believe his good luck right now. That Mr. Witkoff is the envoy of the president, and that this administration is not able to even say that Russia is the aggressor here. So that makes it pretty easy for even an average opponent in this situation. But the President Trump has so much leverage he could be using, and I think most of the Congress has made it clear they want him to do that. But for some reason, he's not. I know there's all kinds of theories out there about why Mr. Trump is so unwilling to be harsh on Putin. I think at the end of the day, he wants to be admired by Putin, and he sees himself along with Xi and Putin as the three sort of big guys that control the whole world, some sort of 18th century spheres of influence. And this is not the sort of international order that is to America's advantage, in my view.
Lily, do we have another question?
Yeah, so speaking along tactical lines, Przemysław Forgot asks, do you think sending more American troops to Poland would be advisable in this current situation and might send a strong signal to Moscow not to escalate the war and restrain its aggressive ambitions? Or would another course of action be advisable?
Well, more important than putting more American soldiers in Poland, and by the way, there's already about 10,000 American troops that are there. About half of them come from the Guard and the Reserve, and the other half are rotational regular Army. Plus, you've got Air Force there almost full time. The most important signal the United States could send is that absolutely 100%, no question about it, we are committed to NATO. We'll defend every square inch of NATO, and that helping Ukraine defeat Russia is part of defending Europe, which is defending America's interests. So you got to do that first. Putting troops somewhere, those are policy decisions. Those are not strategic end state. And that's the hard part, is to clearly identify what is the end state. And the administration has not done that. So instead, he likes the new Polish president in that particular party. So he says, we may increase the number of troops there. What a terrible foundation for strategic decisions, as if these are party favors to hand out. And I think it's not effective, and it's also not a sustainable way to do things. And the Russians, of course, can see this.
Thank you. Zoe, please.
Yes, Sam Harper is curious if you think that internal discontent on the front lines, like the 1917 French troop mutinies, is likely to occur if the war goes on for much longer.
Are we talking about on the Russian side or the Ukrainian side?
It doesn't state that.
Okay, well, I'm gonna try both. First of all, on the Russian side, I think anybody that watches this can see video almost every day of Russian officers killing their own soldiers or beating the hell out of them for not being energetic in the attack or for getting wounded or trying to get out of there. So it's a brutal, brutal army, but it's been that way since the time of the czars. Um, so I think there probably will be individual cases of attempted mutiny or whatever, but um, well, the Russians have a lot of practice on brutally suppressing those kinds of things. Obviously, I'd love it if hundreds of thousands of Russian troops would say, "That's it, I'm done." No way, and refuse to fight. Um, I don't know that that'll happen. Interestingly, I was at an event the other night here in Frankfurt, and there was a young woman who works for a local financial organization, but she was originally from Russia, and she still has friends and family back there. And she said that she had learned that the most common name of Russian soldiers who were killed was Muhammad. In other words, most of the Russian troops that are out there are brought in from all these ethnic regions east of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Very few Russians are recruited out of the two main metropolitan areas, but instead they go out into the other oblasts where you've got different ethnicities and not white Russians. And so that's who's doing a lot of the fighting. Of course, these are the poorest parts of Russia also, and so it's lucrative for them and their families if these guys join up. Now,
Yeah.
on the Ukrainian side, of course, it's very difficult that you've got in a war of attrition that they have not built up enough troops yet to remove all doubt about how long they could do this. And I think it took them a couple of years to realize that they had to fix what we would call the institutional army. That's the part of the army that does recruiting and training and equipping to send troops out into the operational force. And the government has the responsibility, the Ukrainian government has a responsibility to earn the confidence of families that their sons or daughters or brothers or husbands or whatever will not be sent into the meat grinder, but instead will get best training, best equipment, and join a good unit that's ready to go fight, which is how we would do it. They still have part of Ukraine is still in a Soviet mindset. And so they've got to overcome that challenge. Fact is, they've got hundreds of thousands of women and men, military age, that could be brought into armed forces. And I think women in particular, Ukraine has to look at women as soldiers the way we do it in the US and some Western countries, not in a more traditional chauvinistic way, but open it all up. And I tell you what, I've seen plenty of evidence of Ukrainian women that are ready to fight. They just need to be given the chance.
How important is North Korea to Russia militarily?
Well, number one, ammunition wise, they get a huge amount of the ammunition that the Russians use comes from North Korea. So that alone makes it important. Um, what I can't figure out yet is how much the manpower uh, matters. I read yesterday that about 2,000 North Korean soldiers have been killed. That's according to South Korean intelligence. That's their assessment. Um, Putin even thanked Kim Jong-un the other day for the sacrifices of the North Korean army. Um, if North Korea really does provide 15, 20, 30,000 troops, that's not inconsequential. And my Ukrainian friend, who spends most of his time out in the battlefield, said that he can see that the second group of North Koreans are better prepared than the first group.
Mhm. Thank you. Let's get a few more questions, if we may, General Hodges. Lily, please.
Would you be able to elaborate a little more on China's role in supplying Russia with military supplies, etc.?
It looks like China has become much more overt in doing this. At first, they were denying, no, we're not doing anything, but it does seem that um, not just pieces, components that end up in drones, but now actually whole drones assembled are being delivered by China. I don't know the extent or the amounts of ammunition or weapons that they provide, but nobody should think for a second that China is not providing material aid to Russia. I saw a piece the other day, a drone that the Ukrainians had captured or found or shot down, whatever, and in it they were able to figure out that this entire thing had been assembled in China, and so I don't know yet the full impact of it, the extent of it. But I don't think any serious-minded person believes that China is not giving material aid to Russia.
Why would they do that? Is Russia so desperate that they're dependent on that? Or does China not
Absolutely,
care
yes.
about relations with Europe or with the US? Because the Europeans and China, they need each other economically, and they don't want really to fall out with each other.
Well, you answered your own question, Professor Lars. The Chinese can see that Europe desperately needs them as a market, just like we do. I mean, we still import things from China. Um, so if you're thinking strategically, how do you balance your economic needs with your security requirements? And what's in the best interest of the West? It's helping Ukraine defeat Russia. Um, so how do you work with China in such a way that they would no longer want to support Russia? And I think the Senate bill that we talked about earlier, the secondary sanctions, enormous amounts of sanctions on China as well as other countries if they continue to buy Russian oil. Now, China has to have oil like any other large modern country. So, we have to find other solutions for them so that they don't have to have it from Russia. But I'm sure you saw that one of the agreements that came out of this meeting they just had is a new gas line that's going to be built that goes from Russia into China. So I don't see this relationship ending soon unless Russia gets crushed. And of course, the Ukrainians are not going to sit around and wait for them to build that thing. I can go about 6 more minutes.
That is good, because we have 2 or 3 more questions, and then I will ask you a very final question, and then we let you go, and we thank you for your time. Zoe, do you have another question?
Yeah, this is from an anonymous attendee, but they asked if you think the prioritization of financial needs of the U.S. Navy and the Air Force at the expense of the U.S. Army is a mistake that only sends Moscow the signal that the U.S. is seriously preparing for war with China, leaving Europe to be preyed on by Russia.
That's an interesting take, and it's not unreasonable. Uh, I would say, as an Army guy, that our great Air Force and our great Navy desperately need more investment. The Navy is probably half the size it needs to be, and even our ability to do ship repair and ship building is nowhere near what it should be. So I'm not against, uh, you know, resources going to the Air Force and Navy. And certainly the administration, which has the responsibility to determine priorities, sees the Indo-Pacific theater as predominantly an air and land theater, whereas Europe is predominantly a land-centric theater. The Army, I think the Army has always assumed it was going to be the bill payer when it came down to it. Um, at the same time, keep in mind what we have in Europe is about 100,000 troops as guard, reserve, active, rotational, permanent, 100,000. That's how many people sit in Michigan Stadium. So, I mean, it's not that much. And there's not so much stuff, there's hardly anything that we have in Europe that's needed in the Indo-Pacific region. I think at the end of the day, The administration will propose cutting the size of the Army significantly. But of course, you've got a Congress. The Congress is ultimately who has to approve that. And the delegation from Texas and North Carolina and Georgia and Colorado, Kansas will not be too keen about seeing Army presence in their states significantly reduced. So it'll be a
Thank you.
political battle also.
Yeah, thank you. And the final question, Lily, would you have one?
Yes, Gabriel Neal asks if the US maintains their loose stance on Russia over the next few years under this current administration, would you project that Europe will continue to step up and provide more support to Ukraine and fill that gap? And if so, will their dependence on Russian oil hinder things on their end?
So another excellent question. First of all, most of Europe has ended its dependence on Russian oil. They found other sources. Germany built 2 LNG terminals in lightning speed as they got off of Russian gas. It's still not completely off, but nonetheless, I think they recognize that it was a mistake to be so dependent on Russia. Now, Hungary, 100%, Hungary is an absolute agent of the Kremlin. So you've got a NATO country, it's also an EU country, and they are a real problem, at least under the Orban government. I think that what I see in Europe, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, is a sense of urgency. Here in Germany, they are very close to making a decision to return to conscription. That will not be easy, and certainly not every German citizen or family will be happy about it. But I mean, now you've got a coalition government that talks about it, and the defense minister, Mr. Pistorius, is from the SPD, that normally is a center-left party that would not be in favor of this, but they recognize they're going to have to do it. So I think they're trying to ease their way into a system that could lead to conscription, but they need about 80,000 more troops to get the German Bundeswehr up to the size that they believe they need. The defense industry, they just opened up an ammunition plant here in northern Germany last week. 18 months from the time they first put a shovel into the dirt to opening the factory to produce ammunition. That is unbelievable anywhere to build a factory in 18 months, particularly a defense factory in Germany. So these are indicators and it's what gives me some optimism. But each of these leaders also has their own internal domestic challenges. President Macron, I think, what's going on in France is very difficult. In Germany, the coalition is pretty thin with strong challenges from the right. But that's always going to be the nature in democracy, that governments are going to have to deal with domestic as well as foreign challenges.
Thanks very much. If President Trump was listening in, I'm sure he is, what would be the advice you would give to him to finish the war, to end the war in the next few weeks or months, and still make sure that he gets his Nobel Peace Prize?
So, I have to say, in all honesty, I don't care about the Nobel Peace Prize because I never liked a soldier that sought his own award. I don't like anybody that seeks personal attention and applause for themselves. So if the president earns the Nobel Peace Prize, I hope it's because he really earned it, not because he lobbied for it. Having said that, the first step to ending the war in Ukraine would be for the United States and our allies to say that it is in our strategic interest, that this is not charity for Ukraine. It is in our interest that Ukraine is successful, that it defeats Russia and forces Russia to live inside its own borders like everybody else. And then that we, until Ukraine becomes a member of NATO and a member of the EU, that we will continue to invest in Ukraine's defense industry and help them become indigestible to any future Russian aggression.
General Ben Hodges, thank you very much for your advice. Thank you very much for answering all our many questions and for your expertise and insights. It was great to see you again for the fourth time, I think. And you have been as successful and popular as ever. And you should get a medal for serving so hard for the Krasno Global Events Series and UNC Chapel Hill. Thank you very much. I will let you go. I know you have a busy schedule, and it was a pleasure to have you back here at the Krasno Global Events Series. Thanks a lot. Much appreciated.
Thank you for the privilege. I enjoyed it as always.
Bye-bye. All the best.